Hey everyone, welcome to another YouTube video. And in this video, I'll be talking about the monolithic and microservices architecture. So basically, if you're from the software industry, you must have definitely heard about these two different types of software architecture. So today I'll be explaining in depth about what these two types of architectures do and what are the trade-offs between these two and which one to choose and which one would be a much better fit for your application. So without any further ado, let's jump right in. So monolith architecture is more of a traditional software development approach. Like in the software development life cycle, you must have heard about the waterfall terminology, right? So there where like you gather the requirements, then you start developing, then you test, then you do QA, then you deploy your applications. So during the waterfall strategy times, monolith architecture was very popular in the software engineering industry. So basically, monolithic architecture has a single code base that includes all necessary components such as your front and back end analytics and configuration terms. Even though it is a traditional approach, many businesses can still benefit from monolithic architecture. So one of the key advantages of building a monolithic software architecture is that it is faster to develop and deploy when compared with microservices. So you must have a general idea about what microservices is. So even if you don't have a general idea, in the upcoming slides, I'll explain what microservices are in depth. And after this video, you'll definitely get a good understanding of these two different types of architectures. Next one is pros of monolithic architecture. So just like I explained in the previous slide, it is very quick to develop and deploy because there is only a single code base where you have to update your code and then you can deploy your code. And then it is easier to test since your entire code logic is present in a single location and multiple people from your team can easily access the code and clone them and then test the required logic and functions. Requires less maintenance here since it is a single code base. Small DevOps team can maintain your monolithic software architecture. However, there are several cons to the monolithic architecture, and due to those disadvantages, microservices seems to be a much appealing option in the software industry currently. So, coming to the cons of monolithic architecture, complexity increases as application scales up. So yes, if you have a simple single page website or simple e-commerce website, then monolithic architecture might suit well for your needs. But as you grow, as you scale up to like millions of users, say for example, in such a case, a single code base won't be helpful to, I mean, it won't be feasible to maintain when you're serving such a huge volume of requests. And you will have multiple developers, testers, QAs in your team, and multiple people will be accessing your application. So a single code base just doesn't seem to be feasible to scale up to such complex applications. Next one is changes made in one part of the code can possibly affect other parts. Yes, so when you're maintaining a single code base that is tightly coupled and uh, your application, when it is tightly coupled, whenever you make changes, it could break several other parts of your code base without your knowledge. So, for example, if a particular function that is tightly coupled with another function, and while you're trying to enhance uh, a particular module and you don't realize its dependency on the other modules, you will end up like crashing your entire application. Which comes to my last point, single point of failure. Yes, your entire application is based out of a single code base and a single project. So if your project fails, then your entire application will fail in monolithic software architecture. So to address the shortcomings that I just mentioned over here in the cons of monolithic architecture, microservices does exactly that. It addresses the complexity issues of scaling up and scaling down. It addresses the changes where your application won't be tightly coupled, it will be loosely coupled. And it addresses the single point of failure as microservices are distributed distributed in nature, so single point of failure won't occur. So let me just give you a quick overview about the microservice architecture. So the first thing is microservice architecture splits the application logic into separate entities or components. And these components are loosely coupled with each other. This allows us to scale up and down individual services. And also, if a component fails, it does not affect the entire application like monolith. So basically, what this point is trying to say is that in your monolithic software architecture, where your entire project or software application runs on a single code base, but in microservices, your application is split into separate modules that will contain separate functions. So each module or functionality serves an individual purpose, and these different types of microservices, they communicate with each other through HTTP requests over API calls. So this is the most common method of that microservices communicate with the individual components or modules, and it is synchronous in nature. And another popular way of communication among microservices is through message brokers such as Kafka or AWS Kinesis, etc. And this is async in nature. Or you could go for your own individual network mesh in Kubernetes. Uh, that is also another option, but it is not very popular as APIs or message brokers currently in the industry. And the pros of microservice architecture is that it's easier to scale up and down. Whenever you have huge volumes of load, you could scale up the required microservices accordingly, and you could scale down the microservices when you don't have large volumes of spike to meet the demand. Whereas in monolithic architecture, you have to scale your entire application, not just the individual services that needs to be scaled up or down. So thus, your infrastructure costs will be reduced in a microservice architecture. And then you could quickly make changes. You're flexible to make changes quickly in microservices architecture because one module is not dependent on the other, so that you won't have much of a dependency. And in a loosely coupled system, you would even if the code that you have developed breaks, it will only break the individual microservice. It won't bring down your entire application like monolithic architecture where you will experience a single point of failure. However, there are still some cons with microservices architecture. So since microservices is distributed in nature, your security has to be distributed as well. You have to manage security over your HTTP calls or message brokers as well. And you have to have a team to maintain security over the network layer to protect your data during these HTTP calls or transferring messages through message brokers. And obviously, there is increased software complexity since there are many modules, and then your deployment strategies will also vary accordingly. And there is another thing called monorepo and polyrepo. So in monorepo, your entire project, your entire microservices that, so for example, in your software application, you have 4 microservices. All 4 microservices will be present in a single repo, which is known as monorepo. And the deployment strategy, whenever you make changes in a single microservice, your entire application will be redeployed. And for a polyrepo, you will have in our application, you will have different repos for each and every microservice. Even though it sounds simple, but it also increases the CI/CD complexity later on. So finally, I've given you a brief overview about what monolithic software architecture is and what microservices architecture is. So when the time comes on what to choose for your for building your software application, uh, just remember these four main points before making up a decision. The first one is application complexity. So if you prefer microservice architecture, then your application complexity will increase and you would need a team with specialized skill set to develop a distributed microservice architecture. Second one is scalability. If you know that you're going to have a huge volume of users using your application right from day one, then it is better to go for a microservice architecture than start with monolithic architecture. But if you know that your application isn't going to scale largely at start, then you could choose monolithic architecture initially, and then after your application starts to grow, you could definitely switch from monolithic architecture to microservice architecture. And the next one is size of the team. So if you have a very small team initially and without a particular skill set or without high skilled team members, then you should start with monolithic architecture as it is simple to create and deploy and maintain. And once your team starts to get comfortable, then you should switch to uh, microservice architecture. And finally, the time to develop. So monolithic architecture is easy to develop initially and deploy, and comparatively, microservice architecture takes a little more time to design the pipelines for deployment pipelines and then to get the process ready. So based out of these 4 points, you could choose which architecture suits you better for your software application. So if you enjoyed this video, then do like, share, subscribe. And if you have any doubts, then please respond in the comment section and I will try to respond to as many of them as possible. So thank you for watching and I will see you in the next video. Bye.